So, body of cases or um, empirical records is among the um, first um, scholarly interpretations of the use of the word historia, which became, um, I suppose, historia in ancient Greek and historia in Latin, and then history later on. And Leo Strauss says to show it more broadly, we can remember that Leo Strauss says that the biblical Hebrew um, had no word for history, um, either in this sense, although this would have been understood by the writers um, of the Hebrew Bible, but also not in the sense that we're trying to get to, which is the sense of the historical development. When something's developing in history, or total evolution, I suppose one can say. So let's try to see what is the simple principle under which Hegel is understanding this second meaning, which the word history has taken on since the time of Immanuel Kant. This meaning implies something different than what's been understood in the tradition, and therefore by making a distinction, maybe we can illuminate it somehow. In the tradition, we have historia. By the tradition, I mean in Athens, let's say, mainly, especially in Plato and Aristotle. We have, but then, of course, developed by the whole school of Plato, developed by many theologians, developed as they came down to the time of the Enlightenment, when it was superseded as an intellectual authority by mathematical physics and everything that surrounds mathematical physics, and the Enlightenment, inclusive of the whole teaching of Hobbes and Locke. Although Locke is less aware of the fundamental issues than was Hobbes, who had a direct hand in shaping them. This first historia gives a contrast with something like the Platonic dialectic, which wants to, through discussion, through so-called logical or reasoned discussion. The word logos took on a number of meanings that weren't stated explicitly anywhere in Plato, but seem to be discernible. So, for instance, in Martin Heidegger's book on Plato's Sophist, he gives a list of 5 or 6 different distinguishable uses of the word logos by Plato and the works of Plato. So the word took on meanings, the word originally meaning just speech, took on especially the meaning of a kind of calculative activity, being able to calculating in the sense of one calculates that one has enough time to get to the bus stop before the bus arrives, or something in daily life, using speech in a way to make things more secure for reason. And then ultimately the Socratic or Platonic dialectic, or which one uses what Aristotle later put down as the rules of thought, such as the one that we hear most about, being contradiction, but that being dependent on a principle of identity, which would then be the foundation for any contradiction. This sense in which we think we can get to the actual thing, from which we could then deduce, as it were, the accidents below the actual thing, is then works together with this idea of the Historia as empiria, so the cases of medical cases, for instance, which we then have systematically down to work with. Hegel does not want to get to the peak then, therefore, either through collecting examples empirically in the sense of Historia. It's important, I should add, nota bene, not just collecting examples, Hegel, but according to a principle. But this is, as it were, a buried presupposition. In other words, when you think about it, collecting examples must be according to some principle. So, for instance, examples of heart failure, and then you try to look at the examples, see if there's any connection where there's an aha moment and you see the pattern and then you understand. Something like that. But clearly, in fact, we'll go back to this, but Historia in the original record-keeping sense implied this buried presupposition of always according to a principle, collecting examples, and then according to a principle more or less artificial, perhaps. In the other way, so that would be one way to come to understand the world and come to a complete and satisfactory scientific understanding, where scientific means something like mathematicos in the Greek sense, which means something which is like a mathematical unit in the mind, so that it seems to be something that could be accessed eternally. This is full actuality in its simplest case as a number. And then one tries to do the same thing with statements that could be made into laws. So, for instance, that we have a principle. Well, they take the first half of the Decalogue, we could say, for instance. But anyway, putting that aside, Hegel wants to reach the end in a different way. So, for him, the Historia means that it means about the same thing as invisible hand in Adam Smith, in a certain sense, the so-called cunning of reason. So, in the course of all the as apparently accidental happenings of what just comes forward in progression, so that instead of speaking of a field of investigation like that of a spatial field, where you can turn around, look this way, look that way, and which is sort of the same at all times in all places. You just have different directions to look in geographically, so to speak. But instead of that, there's this timeline, which is, of course, it's associated with Christianity because of the vague idea that, and with Judaism, because of the Messiah, or Jesus, is supposed to come. The Savior is supposed to come, and then the Savior comes, and then other things there's supposed to be a second coming of Christ, and then so other things are projected within this field of merely looking around and seeing what happens, and then a whole series of notions is developed about this, which was already richly founded in Aristotle. For instance, Aristotle's kind of tropology, where he shows that certain things although they're one-time events. For instance, Socrates, the life of Socrates is a one-time event. There'll never be another Socrates. Nonetheless, are very profound and seminal in what they show in that event. So it's almost as though the world itself is like an artist who shows us the verisimilitude of some matter which is essential to us. In this field, instead of something comprehensible happening, Hegel sees merely people pursuing more or less high or low aims, base or noble aims. And that this can be understood then in the light of the structures of governments, of states. So the ancient states allowed for corporal punishment. Thucydides was whipped by his Spartan king master, and nobody considered that. Even Thucydides himself didn't consider himself to be his dignity, his fundamental dignity as a being, to have been degraded by that. He merely responded, "Oh, whip me, but listen to me, or hear me." He had something to report to his king, which he was not going to be stopped from reporting because he took some petty offense or etc. So you can see this Spartan attitude is considerably different, and Hegel would have said it was this a defect. So that's this idea of the I forget the phrase for that, but when there was this notion with the German king who spoke about the burn what you have worshipped and worship what you have burned, or the bishop said, or whoever it was, maybe the Bishop of Rome said that to him, or whomever it was, and then you had this notion of the sort of the barbaric virtues and barbaric virtues being a kind of splendid vices. I think the saying was splendid vices. So there is something obviously splendid in this act of almost dazzling, in a certain respect, of this act of the Spartans, who were so totally insensitive to this notion of we've been degraded, or the human dignity has been hurt, or whatever. He didn't care. It didn't degrade him. Because partially because there's less of an individualism didn't exist yet in Sparta, right? But we can see then, in Hegel says there's a point where, and in fact it's right on the cusp of the Biedermeier. In fact, Hegel lived into the Biedermeier period, which is the moment when the bourgeois sort of melded with the priestly caste and with the aristocrats. So you had the bourgeois takeover, and that coincides basically with capitalism. So in other words, there was, the class which Dugan always talks about as the warrior class, the aristocrats of the sword rather than the aristocrats of the robe, or any other form, or any aristocrats who bought their way into their titles. The aristocrats of the sword start to become, at least in part, degraded by the fact that some of them become businessmen, right? So they join on equal footing with the bourgeois, with the burghers, in this sense. The burghers meaning men who live by commerce in the city, and have no part in, as it were, the Carl Schmitt sense of politics of having to worry about existential things. So almost the whole of present-day Deutschland is like that. So because if you look at the statistics of how many people say they're willing to go to war for their country, it's like 80% said they wouldn't be, right? Because they're all just say we're for peace, which is of course, and also that governments are the ones that start war, and there's this terrible dragon called the military-industrial complex, and there's various wicked people, and you can look at Chomsky and he'll tell you all about that. So you have those ideas, which of course always have some measure of truth to them, but on the other hand, what one sees is that there's been a flattening out of the ruling class into this section of those people who wouldn't actually fight for their country and who are in the so-called, in its theoretical form, in so-called society. So society was originally, as Schmitt will tell us, a polemical term in politics, and the separation of state and society, which corresponds to what became then more popular as the difference between government and private life, which characterizes America, Thomas Paine and so on, comes out of older disputes and doesn't necessarily have a real substance to itself. It's like a vestigial distinction that doesn't have necessarily that much meaning anymore, because there will be no sense as a living political issue to say we're going to force every rich person to become a knight, to become an aristocrat of the sword, and stop being merely an aristocrat who's purchased his title through commerce and lives behind the Stadt walls and lives in the citadel where he's defended and somebody else, private mercenaries or soldiers culled from the sort of the outback or the most backwards people in the country into the military as a step up in pride and dignity of place, then stand there as a hedge so that private life can continue undisturbed, so-called private. So in this sense, what Americans call politics is actually just an extension of private life. It's not, for the most part, concerned with foreign policy, and we're always, in fact, we always compartmentalize that and say, there's, for instance, there's people called neoconservatives, George Bush, for instance, and then they're big on, or, were historically big on Rumsfeld or whatever, big on adventure, foreign wars, and so on, and then and it's just as much true of the so-called neoliberals. Obama was all over the place, at the power, and so on. If that's even the totally correct way to speak, since neoliberal is primarily a financial designation, and it kind of covers both the parties so far as they're in the center, not Trump, I would say, because Trump took up the old mercantile style of putting, trying to he did it in a ridiculous way, but it was still a different principle which has some sense to it. In other words, trying to bolster up your own sort of just eating businesses by protecting them against the world market, putting them in an artificial environment until they grow large enough to fend for themselves. That's sort of the idea of these taxes or tariffs, as they're more properly called, that Trump put on steel, on Chinese steel. But that was um, basically just empty gesture, I think, because the steel company wasn't a new budding venture in America, but it was just an old decayed thing, which just protecting it just is like protecting the emaciated old flesh of somebody that's 112 years old, um, which can only, of course, go on for so long. It's different, again, if it was done to protect something which was gestating, which was in its inchoate state, but could be brought to its full state. So within all this range of the use of history, we have the special use of Hegel, of random doings leading to getting to this position of a state around the time of the, like I was saying, the bourgeois takeover in France and in the Biedermeier after Napoleon smashed the Prussians and destroyed the Prussian state and rebuilt it after 1806 as a kind of pseudo-France with French laws and so on. In this condition, then you see the flat opposite of the issue that I was reporting on at the beginning of the Spartan Thucydides. Sorry, not Thucydides. Who was it that said? That guy that said, I cannot fiddle, but I can make a great state out of a small village or something like that. What's his name? It's well, anyway, it's in that film, Lawrence of Arabia, if you look at it. But this juxtaposition to the case Hegel names and the conditions of state and the conditions of life Hegel names are really the conditions of the beginning of capitalism, as so far as capitalism coincides with the bourgeois flattening out the difference between aristocrats, priests, and any other castes, as becoming the lead, becoming the homogeneity of the elites. So in those conditions, the dignity talk, this is as an aside, this is a big subject of Samuel Moyn. The dignity talk, so-called, and it's in a bunch of biblical encyclicals that have to do with the end of the medieval corporations, or the guilds in the end of the 18th century and the beginning of this bourgeois revolution or bourgeois world, which we call capitalism. You can see there is the point where Hegel says, and Schopenhauer says, corporal bodily punishment, the whip is the worst sound in the world, I think Schopenhauer says, is inconsistent with the dignity of human beings. So this situation where it's our so-called doxa from the Greek point of view, which is to say, not opinion is misleading. Our doxa are the views we have through experience. So experience understood as something standing within this accidental, random field where it needs some help from something higher than experience, right? So far in the Socratic discourses, moving up, as in the Politeia or the Republic, we see the views on justice kind of being moved up through applying the notion of you have to remember what you've said, which is the primitive form of the principle of identity, and that you can't say the opposite of what you said, the primitive form of contradiction. So instead of getting there via that path, we've gotten there in Hegel's second version of the meaning of history or historia, or I'm not sure the whole etymology of Geschichte or Geschichte, which is both history and fate, auf Deutsch, but although there's Schicksal is a stronger word for fate, but it still covers both. So this notion of the philosophic Geschichte, but the German both has the word Historia and Geschichte, so that's used. In fact, I've been wondering about that. Nietzsche uses that almost, well, he uses that almost half and half in his famous Uses and Abuses of History, which was written well after Hegel. So in that sense, the second meaning of history, rather than research, investigation, getting examples, etc., is shown. So it's that this, through the historical process, you get to a more rational state, and the more rational state is the state that corresponds to capitalism, and the notion that corresponds to capitalism is dignity talk, and dignity talk implies that there cannot be corporeal punishment under any means, and since this corresponds to Hegel's natural reasoning, he concludes that it's both the most rational and the fin, or the end. It's the absolute. It's the moment when the mind has, or nous, has reached its object as the true and right apprehension of what is right. And this moment, when we come to this moment in Hegel, has provided us with a clarification of something which has been kind of bubbling up, especially since Kant. So Leo Strauss says Kant raised his head at the gate of history, but he didn't go in. But so then everybody that came afterwards was prepared with this, because they had this notion that you have to find the noumena, which corresponds to this correct, this proof that we have the right sense of what's right. Because we know that the cannibal has a different sense of what's right than the burger, than the capitalist, than ourselves has a sense of what's right. So from here, what I want to say is Hegel, it's necessary to think through Hegel in that sense, because he's shown us something, right? But at the same time, what he's shown us is suggestive that what he's saying is false, because he's just like that mosquito that Nietzsche talks about in the extra moral sense of Truth and Lies, who, like every creature, is puffed up as though having themselves at the center of all things. So Hegel, who makes so great an endeavor to decentralize himself, to show so many moves from people who were at the false center, people who had the wrong sense of the right treatment of a human being as a human being, as the dignity of a human being. Hegel himself is compelled to, as it were, uncritically treat himself as the moment, both when this concept of history arises, or at least is brought out of the Christian, sort of vague Christian hope of this state of nature becoming a state of grace, or some kind of theological virtues being at play, or something, into this more Lockean, more naturalistic notion. Remember, in Hegel's time, the notion of evolution was very young and hardly promulgated, and only put forward, not yet put forward by Darwin, but only just sort of groped at, as it were, by a few people. We must understand issues such as this in the light of our best knowledge, such as evolution, or such as the mathematical form of the natural sciences, or anything else that we take to make absolute sense, but can see it's possible to doubt of, and it's possible to make criticisms of. And also remembering the way these things are lodged in our reason, such that our reason itself is our base support in anything we do, but reason in the sense of something makes sense, and then it seems cogent, and so on. And that this is clearly, this sense of reason is clearly different at different times and under different conditions. So we should see, one, Hegel is still active in this sense, because that the strong awareness he brings one of one's the pitfalls in any position is there. He and others who came alongside him and after him have brought this out, and but at the same time that Hegel has shown the falseness of Hegel.